All right, so for urban explosion, we're talking about a time period when people started shifting from living on the farms and being agricultural workers to a more industrial idea and coming into the cities. And there has to be a reason why this happened. And there's a lot of reasons, a lot of things that cooperated to cause us to become a more industrialized system. We were a little later to it. England had industrialized a generation earlier. But people are going to start coming to the city for a lot of reasons. The first one is these industrial jobs. These the fact that farming had become something that was more difficult to do, and you could find jobs, particularly women could find jobs in places like the Lao mills. Your young, unwed women could find jobs. You had sweatshop work. You had situations like people working in steel plants. All of this stuff was beginning to happen. Cities were also a little more egalitarian than the country. Now, egalitarian is an SAT word, and I try and work those in for you. A lot of people don't know what it means. It did show up on the SAT a couple of years ago. It's been on the STAR test before. Egalitarian almost means equality, okay? Equality means that everybody is the same. Egalitarian means that everybody has the same opportunity, okay? So if something is egalitarian, you will have more opportunities for people. And your cities were more egalitarian, particularly for minorities and women. Your minorities could move into minority communities, these ethnic ghettos, and that is a real sociological term. I know we think of a ghetto as being a slang term today, but in reality, in sociology, an ethnic ghetto is just a community where all the people are of the same ethnic minority. For instance, Chinatown would be an ethnic ghetto. You've got your black communities that are ethnic ghettos. Little Italy is one. And your minorities have more opportunities in these communities, because those communities will elect their own city councilmen and their own aldermen and their own school boards and all this stuff. And it meets the needs of those minorities, an opportunity that you would never have anywhere else. Women have more rights in the cities than they do in the in rural areas, largely because they have jobs. And one thing that a lot of you have probably discovered if you have jobs is when you start making your own money, your parents probably give you a little bit more freedom. They don't have to pay for it, so you're able to go do your own thing. Well, women were the same way. They started making some money, and they started helping pay the bills, and they demand a degree of equality because of that. Now, still not equal. Women still don't have the right to vote at this point, but it is more egalitarian. All right. So between 1820 and 1920, in this century period here, about 60 million people worldwide leave the villages, leave the countryside, and move to urban areas. Part of it was health reasons. Part of it was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Back in 1815, the Napoleonic Wars ended. And there's going to be a massive baby boom at the end of that. That's something that we need to be aware of as young, budding historians. And honestly, you're all historians right now, whether you know it or not. A historian is somebody that studies history. I don't know any other definition for it, and that's what you're doing right now. So historians recognize that at the end of any major war or major conflict, there's always a baby boom afterwards. The men have been gone a long time. They return, and they return all at once. Families are reunited, and babies are born 9 to 12 months later. Okay, that's just the way things work. Well, this baby boom at the end of the Napoleonic Wars created an excess of population that about the time we're getting into is going to be coming of age and needing jobs. And there's just not enough farming jobs. So what do? You send them off to the cities, to these industrial jobs. Plus, By the end of this period, and we're a little outside of it when we say 1896, but that's at the very end of this period, the technology has changed so rapidly that one farmhand could do what it took 18 to do as recently as 1836. Okay? So you put 17 people out of work with this new technology. Things like mechanical reapers, primitive tractors, thrashers, pasteurization. All of this stuff is happening that is changing the way we do things. Pasteurization is also going to be important because it's going to increase infant mortality. You're going to have kids that live much, much longer. You're not going to have as many infants die. Well, again, that increases the number of people that need jobs. And frankly, you can't get more jobs in the country. The only place to do that is industrial jobs. It's going to force the cities to develop. Another reason is immigration patterns change. Something we call the new immigration happens. And this is a major shift. If anybody's seen the movie Gangs of New York, I think that's what it's called. I wish I could show it to y'all in school. It's kind of not appropriate for school, but it does a really good job of explaining this time period where the immigration patterns changed. We had always had immigration mostly from Western Europe. Most immigrants had always been English, or if they weren't English, they were Scottish or they were Irish and they spoke some form of English. Most of them were Protestant. Most of them were from a system of government that was similar enough to ours that they mixed well. They already spoke our language. They mixed really easily. But in the 1880s, it's all going to shift, and suddenly we're going to get this massive immigration coming to us from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they're going to be a lot different. They're going to be different religions. A lot of them are going to be Catholic. Now, that might not seem like a different religion to us today. We look at it and we go, Catholic, Protestant, they're all Christian, they get along fine. But throughout most of history, Catholics and Protestants did not get along just fine. And they really didn't consider themselves to be the same religion. Yes, they were both Christian. Yes, they both worshipped, believed in the divinity of Jesus Christ. But that's where it stopped, okay? And these Catholics were oftentimes not trusted by the nativists, the people that were from here. So the Catholics came, and they would tend to gather together in the same area, build these large cathedrals. And there was this fear that the Catholics would never really become loyal Americans because they would have divided loyalty between loyalty to their nation and this foreign prince, the Pope. Remember, the Pope is the leader of his own country. Vatican City is its own nation. Well, which nation are you loyal to? That's going to be a serious question. We're going to get a lot of Jews that come in here, particularly from the Russian states. Russia was having pogroms at this time. If you don't know what that is, they were rounding up the Jewish people, taking their property from them, forcing them into work camps, and in some cases, death camps. We always associate that with World War II and the Nazis, but the Russians were doing it too, well before that. So a lot of Jewish people were coming to America seeking to escape, and they were settling mostly in New York. And there were whole Jewish communities. The Catholics were settling a little in New York, but more in Boston. And you had a big Catholic city happening. You also had some smaller religions coming in. Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, which are offshoots of Catholicism. You had people that were at least ethnically Slavic or Asiatic from places that, like today, we would call Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, those kind of places. And they speak a language that is so different from English that they don't even put their words in the same orders. Verb, subject, object, like we do. Sometimes they would put the object first and then they put the verb first. It makes it very, very hard to learn English. and their language would be very difficult for us. And we just couldn't communicate together. A lot of these guys came as what we call birds of passage. That was a nickname that was given. Usually it was to the adult male that would come over here. And a lot of times the father, the patriarch of the family, would come over, find a job, and try and save up enough money to bring his family later on. Okay? That's why they were called birds of passage. A lot of these left their families behind because they couldn't move, fully intending to go get their family and bring them back. A lot of them did. Some of them didn't. Some of them just left their family behind and started new families in the Americas. This kind of thing happened. And it's something that we had a hard time understanding as nativists in America. Let's look at these numbers. Between 1877 and 1890, there were about 6 million new immigrants that come to America. 6 million in, what's that, a 13-year period. By 1920, that number's reached 30 million. So the new immigration is going to change a lot of stuff. By 1900, Southern and Eastern Europeans are going to make up somewhere around 15% of the population. Now, 15% might not sound like a lot to you. But do you think 15% can cause havoc in a political system? Yeah, think about it. Our elections are oftentimes decided by 1%. 15% come from a different political system than we're used to. There's a lot of fear of this. What are these new immigrants going to do? And are they going to bring the same problems to the United States that they're fleeing from? They're fleeing from nations that are economically collapsing. Are they going to bring that same problem here? That is a real fear. Okay? I think you can see a lot of comparisons to today. And I think the anti-immigration theory that was going on there can be greatly compared to the anti-immigration hysteria that we have in the United States today. How many times have you seen that meme? You know, if they're going to improve our nation, why didn't they improve the nation they came from? You know, that's a nativist thought. And it's something that it's an ugly side of the United States that we've had for a very, very long time. All right. So, are they going to assimilate? If you don't know what the word assimilate means, assimilation is where you become like the dominant culture. It's where you adopt the culture of the nation you've moved to. Okay? And throughout history, our immigrants had always assimilated. You would come here and you had learned how to be an American in school. Think about it. Your first alphabet, you wouldn't have learned back then. A is for apple and B is for bat. You would have learned A is for Adams, the second president. Okay, you would have learned your American history that way. Education was all about creating a good American, assimilating. And we always threw ourselves into society. And these immigrants came and very quickly became very good Americans. That's hard to do if you settle in an ethnic community. Are you going to adopt American customs if you settle in a community where everybody speaks Italian? Where everybody is still holding on to the old ways? Or everybody speaks Chinese? It becomes very hard to assimilate. And these guys assimilate worse. All right, so what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this immigration change? The first thing we're going to do is, back in 1882, we're going to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was a gentleman's agreement between the U.S. and China, where we made a law, write this down somewhere, that for Chinese immigrants to come to America, you must have an advanced education. Now, is that a racist policy? Sure it is. Sure it is. Do I have a problem with saying that to be an immigrant to America, you have to have an advanced education? I don't. I have a problem with saying to be a Chinese immigrant to America, you have to have that. Because they're not, you could come, if you were from Ireland or England, you could come here if you couldn't even spell your name. But if you wanted to come from China, you had to have an advanced education. Okay? So that's a problem. The Chinese Exclusion Act was without a doubt a racist policy. And it was largely pushed for economic reasons. The Chinese on the West Coast were coming in, and they were taking jobs because they would take the manual labor jobs for cheaper wages, and people didn't want them to have their jobs. And then other groups, other nativist groups, start to appear, like the Immigration Restriction League or Immigrant Restriction League. The Immigrant Restriction League pushed for a literacy test. They wanted every immigrant to come to America to have to prove that they are literate in both English and American history and politics, or history and government, before they were allowed to immigrate. Well, honestly, it's pretty hard to become fluent in English and American history and government if you're not living in it. You've got to be immersed in it. So it's pretty hard to do. By the way, they did win out. We did end up getting a citizenship test. You don't have to pass a test to come to America, but you do have to pass a citizenship test to become a citizen. And if you want to know what it takes, you can go look it up online. I have a copy. I used to give it to my students. You'll be surprised how many of you couldn't pass a U.S. citizenship test. It's tough. We expect immigrants to be able to do better on that test than we expect Native Americans to be able to do. And other groups like the APA, the American Protective Association, which is still around today, they wanted no immigration at all. They believed back in 1900 that America was already overcrowded and there wasn't enough land or jobs for any more immigrants, and we should shut off all immigration. Well, that's just ridiculous. You really can't grow without immigration. Your economy would collapse. We never would have had a Steve Jobs if we'd done that. We never would have had a Warren Buffett if we'd have done that. But the idea was there at that time period that we should stop all immigration. I think you can see comparisons to today. If I go too fast, y'all let me know. I put this next part on here strictly because it ended up on a STAR test one year, and I don't know how it ended up. It's not in the TEKS. It doesn't say I have to teach it to you. But one year it ended up on the test, so I put it up here just to kind of cover bases so you can see it. And let's talk about what a city looked like, because they change a lot, and they're still changing. There's a difference in an 18th century and a 19th century. 18th century is the 1700s. 19th century is the 1800s. It's always one behind. So your cities in your 1700s, the center of the city was where your upper class lived. Your wealthiest people lived downtown. They tended to be your merchants, your lawyers, your doctors. They were all downtown. Nice brownstones downtown. And then there's that first ring outside of it, and that's where the middle class would be, because the middle class always wants to be as close to the upper class as they can and still be able to afford it. And then the second ring, the outside, was where the lower class was. And then we had what was called the squatter settlements. And that was these people out in the fringes that weren't even part of society, that were living on land illegally. That was a pretty common way for cities to be set up. But in the 19th century, it's going to flip. And the reason why is because the downtowns get old, and the rich people don't want to live in the old parts, so they move. And what they did is they moved out in the country where those squatter settlements were. They pushed those guys out, and they built themselves these mansions, these large houses, estates basically, kind of like plantations, big estates out there. And that center area that got abandoned is where the minorities and the poverty ended up moving to. So it kind of flips at this time period. Now we've seen the 20th century, it's kind of flipped again because of white flight. Your whites kind of abandoned the cities in the 20th century. So things start to change. I put some diagrams on there for you just so you can see it. I will tell you this will not be on my test. I'm not going to put anything like that on it because I don't think this is important. But since the state put it on the STAR test, I wanted you to at least see what it looked like. So if you want to see, that's a diagram of the 18th century, so you can see the middle is where the rich are, and the further away you got, the poorer you got, okay? In the 19th century, it kind of flips, and you're richer on the outside, and as you move towards the middle, it becomes poorer, okay? It's pretty simple stuff. I just kind of wanted you to be able to at least understand it. Okay. Again, that will not be on my test, but you probably need to be aware of it for your STAR test, and you have to take that one. Urban problems. Let's talk about the issues that come out whenever you start expanding. When your cities start growing too rapidly, you're going to have slums start to develop. Your cities grow faster than your infrastructure does. New York, about half the population is living in slums by this point. The population is approaching 500,000 people already. That's a lot of people. That's a big city for this time period. Today we wouldn't say that was a massive city, but it was very large. And housing was so short because people are moving there that slumlords could get away with charging ridiculous prices for you to live in houses that were oftentimes just falling down around you. Tenement apartments start to occur. If y'all have ever seen the diagrams of dumbbell houses, where the outside is where the apartments were, and you come in and there's a skinny little spot in the middle, and that's where the restrooms were. This was a very, very unsafe, unsanitary way to build a house. And disease spreads quickly. Gambling is out of control in these houses. There's oftentimes illegal casinos in the same buildings where people are living. Prostitution is a massive industry in these cities. Illegal bars start to appear. These unlicensed gin joints that they call blind pigs. The reason they call them blind pigs is because the alcohol they would use, they would make bathtub gin, and it was a wood grain alcohol that they would literally mix in the bathtub and then sell it.
Ew, the girl from Annie.
And what it would do is it would, if you didn't make it right, it could strike you blind. So blindness becomes a big issue at this time period. The fact that the sanitation was so bad, oftentimes as these cities were growing, they didn't have an efficient way of getting waste away. So when you went to the restroom, it would just dump in the streets. And this led to epidemics, fast-spreading disease. 25% of children born in the cities died before their first birthday. That's how bad disease was. 25% never see their first birthday. That's massive, guys. I don't think any of us want to live in a system like this. Because of land shortage, we started developing the first skyscrapers. We started building up. Now at first we can't build very high because our buildings are made of brick and mortar. And honestly, you just can't build brick and mortar very high. Eventually the weight of it will crush down on itself. It can't support that kind of weight. But with improvements to steel, things like the Bessemer process, which was a way of super oxygenating iron to make a steel that was not only stronger but cheaper, we were able to build the first skyscrapers. Now we wouldn't think of them as skyscrapers today. The very first building to be called a skyscraper was this building you're looking at right here, the Flatiron Building. The home insurance building, built in 1885, was 10 stories tall. The Flatiron Building was a little taller than that, but not much. We wouldn't think of a 10-story building as a skyscraper today. There's probably 10-story buildings in Lufkin. I mean, it's not something that we would think of like that. But once upon a time, that would have been considered to be a massive building. Why are they able to do this? Well, two things. Steel improves, and we developed the radiator. Now, we're in Texas. We don't know what a radiator is in Texas. We think it's that thing in your car, okay? But if you lived up north, you'd be very familiar with a radiator. And a lot of the buildings were heated through coal furnaces. But the coal furnace was down in the basement of the building. And they would literally shovel coal in this, and they would have pipes that ran through the building. And this steam that came out would run through the pipes. And you would go over there and turn a knob and adjust the amount of steam that came through the pipes. And the pipes would get hot, and the heat would radiate out and heat the building. Well, that's a fairly safe way to heat a building. I mean, you're probably going to burn yourself at some point when you're going to run into it, but you're not going to burn your building down. Before that, we heated buildings by having individual fires in every room. I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a building made out of wood that has a 10-story building where everybody has a fireplace. Somebody's going to be an idiot, okay? This was just a safer way to do it. So this allows us to build up, and we start seeing a different profile for our cities. That's a pretty big deal. With the growth of cities, we also had the growth of the first political machines. Now, I'll tell you that political machines get a bad rep. And everybody talks about how bad a political machine is. But in reality, there's a purpose behind them. And they're not always bad. What a political machine does is it efficiently organizes the politics in the city so things can get done very quickly. Now, if you have a really good, honest leader that's running your political machine, your city's going to run well. If you have somebody that's corrupt operating your political machine, then it's going to be very, very bad. And oftentimes these machines were very corrupt. And they were fueled by immigrants that came to the country. This is what happened. These political bosses would get together. I'll give you an example. I'm the political boss of your city. You're an immigrant. You just moved to town. You're coming down the gangplank of the ship, and I'm standing down there at the bottom of the gangplank. I got a basket full of food in my hand. I say, "Welcome to the United States. We are so glad to have you. Let me take you off. I got you a little food to get you started. I'm going to help you find an apartment. I'm going to get you a job. Think you and I are going to be friends? Sure. I'm the guy that got you a job, got you started. You're going to trust me, right? Now, the job you're going to get is probably going to be working for one of my businesses. Probably not going to pay you much. And the apartment I'm going to get you, I'm probably going to own and charge you rent in it. But I still got you started. Now, we get you here, we get you going. You're loyal to me, you work for me. Now I go to you and I go, "Listen, I did all these things for you. I just need a favor. It's election day. I need you to go vote. But don't worry about it. I know you don't know what's going on. I'll tell you who to vote for." I swing by, I pick you up, I take you to the voting box, I drop you off, you vote the way I tell you to, you come back. I do that a few hundred times, I can control a vote, right? Well, that's what a political machine does. Now, let's say one of my businesses is I make roads. So I go over to somebody else and I go, "Listen, you want to be city commissioner? I control all these votes around here. I can make you city commissioner. But in exchange, I want the contracts to build the new road in the city." Good deal, right? Thing is, I'm not the cheapest. I'm going to charge too much. This is what happens over and over and over again. And they're efficient. They get things done. The most famous of these is a guy named Boss Tweed, or William Tweed. Boss Tweed was a political boss. He controlled the Tammany Hall machine. It was a Democratic machine in New York. William Tweed was never elected to any political office, but he controlled New York politics. You could not get elected in New York if you didn't go through Boss Tweed, because he controlled the voters. By the way, he was eventually prosecuted for election fraud and ended up going to jail. Philadelphia had a Republican machine. Right here in Texas, in Duval County, we had a guy named Archie Parr that ran a Hispanic voting our political machine. He controlled the way things got done in Duval County. Political machines are just a reality, but they can be very, very dangerous. And at this time period, they were oftentimes very, very bad. Okay? I will tell you that if you get a question on a STAR test about political machines, it's almost always going to be about Boss Tweed, and it's almost always going to be something bad. They're never going to recognize that there is a good side to political machines. Okay? This time period is also the time period where we had an age of reform. Something called the social gospel was out there. A guy named Andrew Carnegie came up with it. We'll talk about him more later. But the social gospel was the thought that we could save all of society. We could save the individual by saving society. So here's the idea. The social gospel would say that, you've got a drinking problem. You drink entirely too much. So how am I going to solve your drinking problem? Well, I'm going to make alcohol illegal for everybody. Or, you're spending entirely too much time with prostitutes, so we're going to make prostitution illegal. This is the way it worked. They tried to pass laws to save the individual from his own weakness by saving all of society. It was a hangover from Puritanism, and it was a massive movement. We also had a movement of settlement houses. This lady right here, this is Jane Addams. Jane Addams came up with Hull House. It was a settlement house. It was like a place that you could live if you were out of work and homeless. But I love Jane Addams. Excuse me. Because she did not believe the government should be the ones to help the poor. She said the poor need help, but they need help by individuals, and she pledged her own money to help people. But here's the other side I like about it. She said, I'm going to give you a place to live, and I'm going to feed you. But it's not going to be super comfortable. The food's not going to be really good, and you're going to have to work. So you had to go look for a job, and you had to work. And if you didn't have a job, she found you a job. And that job, maybe you're out sweeping the city streets in order to keep them clean, or you're working on the road. You're doing something. There is no free ride in the Hull House. And it was not a fun place. Nobody wanted to stay there long. The rooms were uncomfortable, the food wasn't good, and the work was hard. But you were safe. And her thought was, if I don't make you comfortable, you'll get a job and you'll get out and you'll create something for yourself. I kind of like that. Modern settlement houses don't think that way. Now we're going to get into Victorianism, and this is where I get in trouble every year, because we're going to look at Victorianism, and it's a college level class, so we're going to deal with some kind of adult topics in here, and I apologize for that, but it's college history. The Victorian system was very prudish. Get in your mind what you imagine. Get in your mind what you imagine Victorian costuming to be. The women wore high collars all the way up to their chin, high necks. They wore gloves. Their dresses came all the way to the floor. They would wear hats and oftentimes veils covering, because any little bit of hint of flesh would be seen as erotic and hypersexual. Okay? It was believed that men were so sexually weak that seeing the naked ankles of a female would drive them into fits of lust. Okay? That is literally what the thought was. You can't see that. Seeing a female's collar or throat would make you, crazed with sexual fever. That was believed. And the prudery went so far as to furniture, believe it or not. Now, y'all all know what a doily is, right? Y'all have all seen these things, probably on your grandmother's, back of your grandmother or great-grandmother's couch or on a table or something. It looks like a big lace snowflake. Y'all know what I'm talking about? And it's got that hole in the middle. What those were for originally, when they were originally made, now they're just decorations now, but originally there was a string up there, and they would take those and they would tie them around the legs of furniture, like piano legs and the legs of tables, because it was believed that seeing the naked leg of a piano was too sexual. Okay? I kid you not, they thought that men could not control themselves if they saw that kind of stuff. Okay? This is how prude society was. But on the other side, you had, this is the same time period when the first pornographic magazines were coming out, when Jack the Ripper was alive, committing his crimes in England. So you had both extremes happening at the same time. We had a lady named Elizabeth Woodall who actually ran for president. She couldn't even vote and couldn't legally run for president, but she ran a political campaign anyway. Write my name in as the free love candidate. Just sleep with whoever you want to. That was kind of her campaign. We're talking about the 1800s here, not the 1960s. It was a time period of extremes. Extreme prudery on one side and extreme sexual deviance on the other. And like I said, that sometimes gets me in trouble with some people because they feel like we shouldn't talk about this kind of stuff. But it's a history class. It's part of our history. We at least need to be aware of it. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded at this time period because of the extremes of alcohol. And they are preaching that alcohol should be illegal because it was believed, they called it demon rum, that demon rum caused men to get drunk and come home and abuse their wives. People like Carrie Nation are going to come about. Her nickname was Molly Hatchet. Carrie Nation would travel around the country. She was this little bitty white-haired woman. In fact, when y'all were kids, did y'all watch the Sylvester and Tweety shows on cartoons when you were a kid? You know Granny on those?
Granny, yes.
Granny is based on Carrie Nation. They drew her based on Carrie Nation, okay? Now, Carrie Nation would literally come in with her mob of angry blue-haired women. They would kick the doors in on bars and with hatchets destroy the bar, okay? That's what was going on at this time period. By the way, if any of you ever get to San Antonio, I'll tell you, when you're going in, if you're standing in front of the Alamo looking at it, if you don't know what the Alamo is, that's that big building in downtown San Antonio that looks like a Taco Bell, okay? You're standing there, you're looking at it. Right to the right is a hotel called the Meeker Hotel, and there's a bar downstairs called the Roosevelt Bar. You can go in, even if you're underage, because they have a trophy case in there of a bunch of Roosevelt stuff, but they also have the hatchet inside there that Carrie Nation used when she kicked the door into that place.
That hotel stinks, and it is haunted, by the way.
I love that hotel, but it's very, very old. You stayed in it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we stayed in it one year when Dad had to go down there for school board meetings and stuff.
I stayed in it years and years ago.
It's pretty cool, but it's kind of creepy.
Yeah, a lot of people do think it's haunted. It's kind of a bizarre place. I don't mind it. It's an interesting place anyway. So, But that bar is pretty cool down there to see that. Did you go in and see the trophy case and all?
We did.
Yeah.
We pretty much toured it.
And you can see in the bar, you can see the axe marks where the hatchets hit the bar. Kind of a neat thing. Intellectually, at this time period, we had a lot of change. This is kind of the golden age of public education. We started building schools all over the place, even in the South. And in the South, we fought it for a long time. We didn't want education for a long time. The first postgraduate education on a large scale was going on. For the first time, you could get a postgraduate degree in something besides the law and divinity. You could go get a master's degree in English or history or business or whatever. The arts were very realistic at this time period. What that means is, and I'd like to show you some pictures. I probably won't be able to do the lecture because we're behind, but I'll probably post it up so you can see it, of some of the art from the time period. The art was, I like to call it the warts and all system. They drew things as realistic as they could. If you had a great big wart on your nose, the painter would paint it there, okay? Because they want everything to be hyper-realistic. It's also the first time that we have mass culture. What that means is leisure time is something new. Think about it. When you lived on the farm, you didn't have leisure time. There was always something to do. But all of a sudden, if you have a job where you work 10 to 12 hours a day, you have 12 to 14 hours a day where you're off. And you only spend 8 of that sleeping, so what do you do with the rest of it? Well, baseball clubs developed. Bicycle clubs developed. Coney Island, the very first amusement park, was built at this time period. All this stuff was going on. By the way, you might not have recognized baseball back then because every club had their own rules. In Boston, they played with only 2 bases. You would hit the ball, you'd run to the base, and then you'd run back, and if you made it there and back, you got a score. They had all kinds of different scores, different rules for this kind of stuff. I think that's a good place to stop because the next set is about labor, and that's a pretty long section, and I don't want to break it up. So we'll stop there for the day. We will pick up here again on Wednesday, and hopefully we'll be done by next Monday. And I'd like to have the test probably in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from today will be our test. Okay, that's the plan anyway. Y'all have a good day. If you got any questions, you can email me, text me, send up smoke signals, something, and I will be glad to respond. I will see y'all next time.